The stars blurred into streaks of white as Jack Tanner's smuggling ship, the Rusty Fawn, spiraled out of control. Alarms screamed through the cockpit, red lights flashing like angry eyes. Jack gripped the controls, his knuckles white, sweat dripping down his weathered face. He'd seen worse, pirate raids, asteroid fields, even a run-in with a black hole's edge, but this was different. The engine sputtered, coughing out its last breath as the planet Clithera loomed closer, a shimmering violet orb against the black void. He'd meant to skim its orbit, drop his cargo, and bolt. Instead, the ship's core had picked the worst moment to fail. "Come on, you junk heap, hold together," Jack muttered, yanking levers and slamming buttons. The Fawn didn't listen. It plunged through Clithera's atmosphere, heat shields glowing cherry red. The ground rushed up, a jagged mess of violet cliffs and glowing forests. Jack braced himself, muttering a half-remembered prayer from his childhood on Earth's dusty colonies. The impact came hard, metal screeching as the ship carved a trench through alien soil. Darkness swallowed him. When Jack woke, his head throbbed like a drum. Smoke curled from the wreckage, stinging his lungs. He coughed, dragging himself free of the cockpit's twisted remains. His flight suit was torn, one sleeve dangling like a broken wing, but he was alive. That was something. He squinted at the alien landscape, trees pulsed with faint light, their branches swaying without wind. The air smelled sharp, like ozone after a storm. He'd survived crashes before, but never on a planet this strange. Before he could get his bearings, a shadow fell over him. Jack tensed, hand instinctively reaching for the blaster at his hip, gone, lost in the wreck. Figures emerged from the glowing trees, tall and lean, their skin a deep indigo that shimmered under the twin suns. Their eyes glowed faintly, gold and unblinking, locked on him. Clitherans. He'd heard of them, telepathic, proud, not fond of outsiders. Jack raised his hands slowly, forcing a grin. "Hey, thanks for the welcome party. Just passing through, no trouble intended." The tallest figure stepped forward, a female with sharp features and a staff crackling with energy. Her voice echoed in his skull, not his ears, clear and cold. "You are alive because we willed it, human. Your craft breached our skies, and we pulled you from its ruin. By the law of Clithera, those saved must serve." Jack blinked, the words sinking in. "Serve? Look, lady, I appreciate the rescue, but I'm not signing up for anything. I've got places to be." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "I am Mira, first blade of the Western clan. You have no choice. Refuse, and the law demands your end." Her staff hummed louder, a threat wrapped in calm. Another figure approached, male, slighter than Mira but with the same piercing gaze. He carried a device pulsing with light, scanning Jack from head to toe. "Fascinating," he said aloud, his voice softer but still ringing in Jack's mind. "A human. Chaotic brain patterns, no telepathic resonance. I'm Kale, second mind of the clan. You're an anomaly here." "Great, I'm a science project," Jack muttered. "Listen, Mira, Kale, I'm Jack Tanner. Smuggler, pilot, guy who'd really like to fix his ship and leave. No serving required." Myra's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "Your ship is ash. And the law is absolute. You will aid us against the Eastern Clan, or die." Jack's stomach dropped. He'd heard rumors of Clithera's civil war, two factions locked in a centuries-long feud. Smugglers avoided the planet for a reason. "Aid you how? I'm no soldier. I move cargo, dodge patrols, that's it." Kale's device beeped, and he frowned. "Your mind resists order, yet it adapts quickly. That may be useful. The Eastern Clan grows bold, raids, sabotage. We need every edge." Jack opened his mouth to argue, but a distant rumble cut him off. The ground shook, and a plume of dust rose beyond the cliffs. Myra's staff flared, and Kale's device flickered wildly. "Ambush," Mira hissed, spinning toward the sound. "They've tracked us." Before Jack could process, shapes burst from the trees, more Clitherans, but their armor was darker, etched with jagged red lines. Energy bolts sizzled through the air, scorching the ground near Jack's feet. He dove behind a rock, heart pounding. Mira moved like a storm, her staff deflecting blasts with precision, while Kale crouched, fingers flying over his device to jam the enemy's signals. Jack peeked out, mind racing. He wasn't armed, wasn't trained for this, but he'd survived worse odds by thinking fast. His eyes caught the wreckage of the Fong, a jagged chunk of hull glinting in the sunlight. An idea sparked. He bolted from cover, ignoring Myra's telepathic shout, "Stay down, fool," and reached the wreck. The auxiliary battery was intact, a small power cell humming faintly. Dangerous, unstable, but workable. He ripped it free, wires sparking in his hands, and shouted, "Mira! Throw this at them." She turned, confusion flashing across her face, but years of combat honed her instincts. She snatched the battery and hurled it toward the attackers. Jack grabbed a loose cable from the wreck, aimed, and fired a wild shot of electricity from its frayed end. The spark hit the battery midair. The explosion was deafening. A wave of heat and light blasted outward, knocking the enemy flat. Mira and Kale ducked, shielding their eyes as debris rained down. When the dust settled, the attackers were groaning, disoriented, their weapons fried. Jack grinned, brushing soot from his hands. "Told you I'm no soldier. I improvise." Mira straightened, staring at him. Her staff lowered slightly. "Reckless. Effective. Perhaps you're not useless." Kale approached, scanning the aftermath. Unpredictable energy discharge. No Clitheran would attempt that. "Your chaos, it worked." Jack shrugged, catching his breath. "Yeah, well, chaos is my specialty." "So, what now? You still planning to chain me to your war?" Myra's golden eyes met his, unreadable. "The law binds you, human. But you've earned a moment to prove yourself. Come." We return to the Western Hold. Kale nodded, tucking his device away. "I'm curious to see what else your mind can do, Jack Tanner. This war may yet turn on it." Jack followed, his boots crunching on alien soil. He didn't like being forced into anything, but he'd survived the crash, the ambush, and now he had a chance to turn this mess around. The Clitherans thought they'd snared a servant. They didn't know it yet, but Jack Tanner didn't bend easy. He'd find a way out, or a way through. Either way, he'd make sure they remembered him. The trek to the Western Hold was long, the twin suns sinking low, casting eerie shadows across the glowing forest. Mira led, her pace relentless, while Kale trailed behind, muttering to his device. Jack kept up, his mind buzzing with questions. What did they expect from him? How long could he stall before they enforced their law? And what was it about these two that made him wonder if he could actually help? As the hold spires rose into view, tall, curved structures of violet metal shimmering against the dusk, Jack felt a flicker of something new. Not just survival. Curiosity. Maybe even a spark of defiance. Whatever came next, he'd face it his way. And the Clitherans? They'd just have to keep up. The Western Hold loomed like a fortress carved from the stars themselves, its violet spires piercing the twilight sky of Clithra. Jack trudged behind Mira and Kale, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, glowing moss that carpeted the ground. The air buzzed with faint energy, a hum that set his teeth on edge. He'd never been one for fancy places, give him a grimy spaceport cantina over a palace any day, but there was no denying the Hold's presence. It felt alive, watchful, like it was sizing him up as much as the Clitherans were. Mira strode ahead, her staff tapping the ground with each step, a rhythm that matched her unyielding pace. Cale lingered closer to Jack, his scanning device flickering as he muttered to himself, stealing glances at the human like he was a puzzle to solve. Jack caught his eye and smirked. "What's it say now? Still chaotic?" Cale's lips quirked, a rare hint of humor. "Your brain waves defy every model I've built." "It's intriguing." "Intriguing's one way to put it," Jack said, rubbing the back of his neck where a bruise from the crash still ached. "Most folks just call me a pain in the ass." Mira glanced back, her golden eyes sharp. "Both are true. Now move. The council awaits." Jack sighed but picked up his pace. The council. Great. More Clitherans to glare at him, probably deciding whether to chain him to their war or toss him out an airlock. He didn't like being cornered, but he'd play along, for now. Survival was step 1. Step 2 was figuring out how to turn this mess into an exit ticket. Inside the hold, the air shifted, cooler and heavier, laced with the scent of metal and something floral. The council chamber was vast, its walls lined with Clitherans in sleek robes, their indigo skin catching the light of floating orbs that pulsed like tiny suns. At the center stood a raised platform where 3 figures waited, their presence heavier than the rest. Mira and Cale flanked Jack as they approached, and he felt the weight of 100 telepathic stares boring into his skull. The eldest council member, a female with silver streaks in her dark hair, spoke first, her voice a calm echo in his mind. "Jack Tanner, human. You stand bound by the law of Clithera. Your actions at the crash site suggest potential. But potential is not trust. Why should we spare you a warrior's duty?" Jack squared his shoulders, meeting her gaze despite the urge to look away. "Because I'm not here to die for you, or anyone. I'm a pilot, a fixer. I saved your people out there with a busted battery and some luck. Give me a chance, and I'll prove I'm worth more alive than dead." A murmur rippled through the chamber, a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Mira stepped forward, her staff glowing faintly. "He disrupted the eastern ambush. Reckless, yes, but effective. I'd train him myself." Cale nodded, holding up his device. "His unpredictability could be an asset. I'd study him, adapt his methods to our strategies." The council leader's eyes narrowed, but after a long silence, she gestured. "Very well. Mira, Cale, he is your charge. Prepare him for the eastern assault. If he fails, the law claims him." Jack exhaled, tension easing slightly. He'd bought time. Now he just had to survive whatever training meant on this planet. The next morning, Jack found himself in a training yard carved into the hold's lower levels. The ground was smooth stone, etched with glowing runes, and the air crackled with energy. Mira stood across from him, her staff replaced by a blunt training rod. She moved like a predator, circling him, her eyes locked on his every twitch. "You fight like a human, sloppy, desperate. That won't do." Jack wiped sweat from his brow, gripping a matching rod they'd given him. "Sloppy's kept me alive so far. What's your plan, turn me into one of you?" "No," she said, lunging forward. Her rod cracked against his, jarring his arm. "I'll make you better." The session was brutal. Mira was fast, precise, every strike aimed to teach or punish. Jack dodged what he could, swung back when he saw an opening, but mostly he ate dirt. By the end, he was bruised and panting, sprawled on the stone while Mira stood over him, barely winded. "You're stubborn," she said, offering a hand. "That's a start." He took it, pulling himself up. "Stubborn's my middle name." "Well, that and trouble." She almost smiled, almost. "Rest. Tomorrow, we fix your stance." Later, Cale summoned him to a chamber filled with humming machines and holographic displays. The strategist sat cross-legged, surrounded by floating data streams, his device pulsing in sync. Mira builds your body, he said without looking up. I'll build your mind. The Eastern Clan's stronghold is fortified, walls, drones, telepathic jammers. We need a plan. Jack leaned against a console, catching his breath. Sounds like a fortress. You got firepower to match? Not enough, Kale admitted. Their numbers grow. We need something they won't expect. Jack's eyes drifted to a corner where a twisted hunk of metal sat, a piece of the Rusty Fong's engine, salvaged from the wreck. An idea flickered. What if we don't hit them head-on? Use something they've already written off, like that. He pointed at the wreckage. Kale frowned, scanning it. A dead ship? It's useless. Not if we make it a bomb, Jack said, grinning. Rig the core to overload, sneak it in, let it rip. Chaos is my specialty, remember? Kale paused, his device flickering as he ran calculations. Unorthodox. Risky. But, possible. I'll need time to adjust the specs. Take all the time you want, Jack said. Just don't blow us up testing it. Days blurred into a rhythm, sparring with Mira, plotting with Kale. Jack's body ached, his mind stretched, but he felt the shift. Myra's strikes grew less punishing, more guiding, and Kale started asking his opinion instead of dismissing it. They were still aliens, still holding him to their law, but something was changing. Respect, maybe. Or at least curiosity. Then trouble hit. Late one night, an explosion rocked the hold's outer wall. Jack jolted awake in the small quarters they'd given him, the air thick with smoke. He stumbled outside, finding Mira and Kale already there, barking orders to guards. A gaping hole smoked in the wall, and a figure lay sprawled nearby, an indigo-skinned Clitheran, unconscious, a sabotage device clutched in his hand. Traitor, Mira growled, her staff flaring. Eastern spy. Kale scanned the device, his face grim. Sophisticated. He bypassed our defenses. There may be more. Jack crouched by the saboteur, noticing something, a faint scar on his neck, shaped like a claw. Wait. I've seen this mark before. On a guy at the crash site, one of your scouts. He wasn't fighting with us, he was watching. Myra's eyes widened. You're sure? Sure as I'm standing here, Jack said. He's been playing you. Probably feeding intel to the east. Kale's device confirmed it, pulling up a profile. Torin. Low-rank scout. Access to our perimeter logs. He's the leak. Myra's grip tightened on her staff. I trusted him. Trust's a luxury, Jack said, standing. Learn that smuggling. Let me help you flush out the rest. I know how rats think. She hesitated, then nodded. Do it. Over the next hours, Jack led them through the hold, pointing out oddities, a scuff mark on a vent, a tool left out of place. His years dodging lawmen and rival crews paid off. They caught 2 more spies, both marked with the same scar, both confessing under Myra's glare. By dawn, the hold was secure again, and Jack collapsed against a wall, exhausted but alive. Mira approached, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. You see what we don't. That's rare. Comes with the territory, Jack said. You live on the edge long enough, you learn to spot the cracks. Kale joined them, his device quiet for once. The bomb idea, it's ready. Your instincts saved us today. I misjudged you. Jack chuckled, brushing dirt from his hands. Happens a lot. So, what's next? We blow up the east, or they try again. Myra's eyes met his, steady and fierce. We train harder. Plan smarter. They'll come for us, but we'll be ready. Kale nodded, a spark of excitement in his gaze. With your chaos, Jack Tanner, we might just win. Jack looked between them, feeling the shift. He was still bound, still trapped, but for the first time, he didn't mind so much. These two, they were starting to feel less like captors and more like partners. And that bomb? It was just the beginning. The Eastern clan wouldn't know what hit them. The night sky above Clithera burned with streaks of violet and gold, the twin suns long gone, replaced by a restless shimmer of stars. Jack stood at the edge of the Western Hold's launch bay, wind tugging at his patched-up flight suit. Below him, a sleek Clitheran skiff hummed, its hull glowing faintly against the dark. Mira paced nearby, her staff strapped to her back, her indigo skin catching the light as she checked her gear. Kale sat cross-legged by the skiff's controls, his device projecting a holographic map of the Eastern Clan's stronghold, a fortress of spiked towers and pulsing energy shields nestled between jagged cliffs. Jack flexed his hands, still sore from days of training in tinkering. The bomb they'd built from the rusty Fong's wreckage sat in the skiff's hold, a tangle of wires and metal that looked more like scrap than a weapon. But he knew it worked, he'd tested it himself, nearly singed his eyebrows off in the process. Tonight, they'd use it to crack the Eastern Clan's defenses. Or die trying. Mira stopped pacing, her golden eyes locking on him. "You're sure this will work?" "Sure as I can be," Jack said, patting the bomb's casing. "Overload the core, sneak it past their shields, boom. Chaos does the rest." Kale glanced up from his map, his voice steady but edged with tension. "Their jammers block our telepathy beyond the shields. We'll be blind inside. Your chaos better be enough." Jack grinned, though his stomach twisted. "Blind's my specialty. Let's move." The skiff lifted off with a soft whine, skimming low over the glowing forests. Jack gripped the railing, the wind sharp against his face. Mira stood beside him, silent but alert, while Kale piloted, his fingers dancing over the controls. The plan was simple: slip through a gap in the Eastern patrols, drop the bomb near their power grid, and get out before it blew. Simple didn't mean easy, though. Jack had run enough smuggling jobs to know plans like this loved to go sideways. The stronghold came into view, a dark silhouette against the cliffs, its shields flickering like a storm about to break. Kale angled the skiff toward a narrow ravine, a blind spot he'd mapped from stolen data. The walls closed in, stone scraping the hull, but they made it through. Jack's heart pounded as they touched down behind a cluster of jagged rocks, the bomb's weight a cold comfort in his hands. Mira took point, her movements fluid and silent, leading them toward the grid, a towering structure pulsing with violet light. Jack followed, hauling the bomb, while Kale scanned for patrols. The air grew thick, the jammer's interference buzzing in Jack's ears like a swarm of bees. He couldn't hear Mira or Kale's thoughts, but he didn't need to, their nods and gestures were enough. They reached the grid's base, a maze of pipes and cables humming with power. Jack set the bomb down, wiping sweat from his brow. 5 minutes to arm it. Cover me. Mira nodded, slipping into the shadows, while Kale crouched nearby, his device flickering as he fought the jammers. Jack worked fast, connecting wires, setting the timer. His hands shook, not from fear, but adrenaline. He'd always thrived in moments like this, when everything hung on a thread. A shout broke the silence. Jack's head snapped up as Eastern guards emerged from the dark, their armor glinting red, energy rifles blazing. Mira leapt into action, her staff ablur, deflecting bolts with lethal grace. Kale ducked, his device sparking as he tried to jam their comms. Jack cursed, fumbling the last wire. Almost there. Mira took a hit, a bolt grazing her arm, and stumbled. Jack's gut clenched. He abandoned the bomb, grabbing a fallen rifle, and fired wild shots to draw the guards off her. Mira, get down. She glared at him, blood trickling down her arm, but dropped behind a pipe. Jack kept firing, the rifle's kick bruising his shoulder. Kale shouted, 2 minutes, they'll call reinforcements. Jack slid back to the bomb, slamming the final connection home. The timer blinked to life, 4 minutes. Done. Let's go. Mira pulled herself up, her jaw tight, and they ran. The skiff was 100 yards away, guards closing in. Jack's lungs burned, his legs screaming, but he didn't stop. He'd survived too much to die here. They piled into the skiff, Cale gunning the engines as bolts scorched the hull. The bomb's explosion lit the night, a fireball swallowing the grid, shields collapsing in a cascade of sparks. Jack whooped, adrenaline surging. Told you it'd work. Mira clutched her arm, her voice sharp. Reckless. You nearly got us killed. But we're alive, Jack shot back, catching her eye. And they're hurting. Cale's hands steadied on the controls, a rare smile tugging at his lips. The grid's down. Their drones are offline. We've got a window. The skiff sped back to the hold, the stronghold's chaos fading behind them. Jack leaned against the railing, catching his breath. They'd done it, struck a blow the Eastern clan wouldn't forget. But the victory felt fragile. He'd seen the guards' numbers, their weapons. This wasn't over. Back at the hold, the mood was tense. Myra's arm was patched by a medic, her glare fixed on Jack as he paced the council chamber. Cale briefed the leaders, his holographic map showing the damage, power out, defenses crippled. The council leader's voice echoed in Jack's mind. A bold strike. But the East will retaliate. Their armada gathers. Jack stopped pacing, his mind racing. Then we hit them again, harder. They're off balance now. Mira stood, wincing but firm. He's right. We can't wait for them to recover. Cale hesitated, then nodded. I'll refine the strategy. Jack's methods, they work. The council agreed, and Jack felt a flicker of pride. He wasn't just a tool anymore, he was part of this. But pride didn't last. Hours later, alarms blared through the hold. Jack bolted to the command deck, finding Mira and Cale staring at a hologram, an Eastern fleet, ships bristling with cannons, closing in fast. They're early, Cale said, his voice tight. The grid loss pushed them to act. Myra's staff flared. We fight. No retreat. Jack studied the hologram, his smuggler's instincts kicking in. Fighting's not enough. We need a trick, something big. Cale turned to him. What do you mean? Jack pointed at the map, Clithra's moons glowing faintly. Those moons, they've got gravity, right? What if we use them? Mira frowned. A weapon? How? Pull their fleet off course, Jack said, his mind spinning. Rig something to mess with their navigation, make them crash or scatter. I've seen it done with asteroid fields. Cale's eyes lit up, his device already humming. Possible. The moon's fields could amplify a signal. But it's untested. Untested's my favorite word, Jack said, grinning. Let's get to work. The next hours were a blur. Jack and Cale jury-rigged a transmitter from salvage tech, while Mira rallied the hold's fighters. The Eastern fleet drew closer, a dark tide against the stars. Jack's hands moved fast, sweat beading on his forehead as he synced the transmitter to Cale's calculations. Mira watched, her usual fire tempered by something new, trust. It's ready, Cale said finally, the device pulsing. If this fails. It won't, Jack cut in, meeting Myra's gaze. We've got this. She nodded, a silent agreement. The transmitter fired, a wave of energy rippling toward the moons. The fleet faltered, ships veering as their systems glitched. Some collided, others spun off course. Cheers erupted in the hold, but Jack stayed focused. Step 1. Now we hit them. The battle was fierce. Clitheran skiffs clashed with eastern ships, energy bolts lighting the sky. Jack piloted one, Mira at his side, her staff deflecting incoming fire. Cale coordinated from the hold, his voice steady in their comms. They fought as a unit, Jack's wild maneuvers meshing with Myra's precision and Cale's tactics. Slowly, the tide turned, the eastern fleet thinned, retreating in disarray. Back at the hold, exhaustion hit hard. Jack slumped against a wall, Mira and Cale beside him. The council leader approached, her voice warm. "You've proven yourself, Jack Tanner. The East is broken, for now." Jack nodded, too tired to grin. "For now's good enough." Mira rested a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but firm. "You fought like one of us." Cale's gaze softened. "No, like something better." Jack looked between them, the weight of their words sinking in. He'd come here a prisoner, but now he was something else. The war wasn't over, but they'd won this round, together. And whatever came next, he'd face it with them. The air in the western hold crackled with tension, the violet walls reflecting the dim glow of emergency lights. Jack stood on the command deck, his flight suit streaked with grime, staring at the holographic display. The Eastern Clan's armada loomed larger than ever, a swarm of jagged ships, their hulls bristling with cannons, cutting through Clithera's orbit like a blade. The moon's gravity trick had scattered their first wave, but this was the real fight. The East had regrouped, reinforced, and they were coming to end it. Mira paced beside him, her staff humming faintly, her injured arm still bandaged but her fire undimmed. Cale hunched over his device, fingers flying as he tracked the fleet's movements. The council chamber buzzed with Clitheran voices, telepathic and spoken, a mix of fear and defiance. Jack's chest tightened. They'd won battles, but this was war, and he was still a stranger here, bound by a law he hadn't chosen. Yet somehow, it didn't feel that way anymore. "They're closing fast," Cale said, his voice tight. 2 hours until they breach our defenses." Mira stopped pacing, her golden eyes fierce. "We meet them head-on. No surrender." Jack shook his head, his smuggler's mind churning. "Head-on's what they expect. We've got to hit them where it hurts, something they can't predict." Cale glanced at him, curiosity flickering. "The moons again?" "Bigger," Jack said, pointing at the hologram. "Those moons aren't just rocks, they've got pull. What if we turn them into a sling? Drag their whole fleet off course, smash them into each other?" Mira frowned, her staff dimming. "That's madness. Even for you." "Maybe," Jack admitted, grinning despite the odds. "But madness is why I'm still breathing. Cale, can you make it work?" Cale's device pulsed as he ran the numbers, his brow furrowing. "Theoretically, yes. We'd need to amplify the moon's gravitational fields, sync them with a pulse from our transmitter. But the power draw, it'd drain the hold's core." "Drain it," Jack said. "We lose this fight, there's no hold left anyway." Myra's gaze locked on his, searching. Then she nodded. "Do it. I'll ready the skiffs." Cale hesitated, then dove into the plan, his voice steadying as he worked. "I'll need you on the transmitter, Jack. It's your chaos we're betting on." Jack clapped his shoulder. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The next hour was a frenzy. Jack and Cale hauled the transmitter to the hold's roof, a flat expanse under Clithera's stormy sky. The device was a mess of wires and salvaged parts, twice as big as before, its core glowing with unstable energy. Jack's hands moved fast, syncing it to Cale's calculations, while the strategist muttered equations under his breath. Below, Mira led the skiff pilots, their engines roaring as they prepped for a last stand. The fleet drew closer, a dark tide blotting out the stars. Jack wiped sweat from his eyes, the wind howling around him. "Ready?" Cale nodded, his device linked to the transmitter. "Pulse in 3, 2, 1. Jack slammed the activation switch. The transmitter roared to life, a wave of energy surging toward the moons. The ground trembled, the hold's lights flickering as power drained. In the sky, the moons pulsed, their faint glow intensifying. The eastern ships faltered, veering as gravity tugged them off course. Some collided, hulls crumpling in silent explosions, while others spun helplessly into the void. Jack whooped, pumping a fist. "It's working." Cale's eyes widened, tracking the chaos. Half their fleet's down. But the rest, they're adapting. Myra's voice crackled through their comms, sharp and urgent. "Jack, Cale, get to the skiffs. They're breaking through." Jack grabbed a rifle from a nearby crate, Cale snatching his device. They bolted down the stairs, the hold shaking as enemy fire rained down. Outside, the sky burned, eastern ships weaving through the moon's pull, their cannons blazing. Myra's skiff hovered nearby, her staff deflecting bolts as she waved them in. Jack leapt aboard, Cale stumbling behind. "Go, go," he shouted, and Mira gunned the engines. The skiff shot into the fray, joining a swarm of Clitheran fighters. Jack manned a turret, firing wild bursts at the enemy, while Mira danced the skiff through the chaos, her movements fluid despite the odds. Cale patched into the comms, coordinating the fleet with calm precision. The battle was brutal. Ships exploded around them, debris raining like meteors. Jack's turret overheated, smoke stinging his eyes, but he kept firing. Mira took a hit, the skiff lurching, and Jack lunged to steady her. "You okay?" "Fine," she snapped, though her grip tightened on his arm. "Keep shooting." Cale's voice cut through. "Their flagship, it's powering up. If it fires, we're done." Jack spotted it, a massive ship, its cannons glowing violet, dwarfing the rest. His mind raced. "Mira, get us close. I've got an idea." She glared at him. "Close? You're insane." "Trust me," he said, meeting her eyes. She hesitated, then nodded, banking the skiff toward the flagship. Jack grabbed the bomb's remote, a backup he'd rigged earlier, just in case. "Cale, boost the transmitter one more time." "Full power." Cale's fingers flew, the device sparking. "It'll burn out." "Do it." Jack roared. The transmitter pulsed again, weaker but enough. The moons flared, dragging the flagship off balance. Jack aimed the remote and pressed the trigger. The skiff's cargo bay opened, ejecting a second bomb, smaller, but packed with the Fong's last scraps. It sailed toward the flagship, detonating in a blinding flash. The flagship erupted, a fireball swallowing its escorts. The Eastern Fleet faltered, then broke, ships fleeing into the dark. Cheers echoed through the comms, Clitheran voices rising in triumph. Jack slumped against the turret, exhaustion hitting like a wave. Mira eased the skiff back, her breath ragged, while Cale stared at the fading chaos, a rare grin breaking through. They landed at the hold, the ground littered with debris, the air thick with smoke. The council leader emerged, her robe singed but her presence unshaken. "The East is routed. You've saved us, Jack Tanner." Jack shrugged, brushing soot from his hands. "Took a team effort." Mira stepped closer, her staff quiet now. "Your chaos, it turned the tide." Cale nodded, tucking his device away. "Your mind, it's more than I calculated. We'd have lost without it." The leader's voice softened. "The law bound you here. But you've earned freedom. Will you go?" Jack looked at the sky, then at Mira and Cale. He'd come to Clithera a drifter, a smuggler with no ties. Now he had something else, people who'd fought beside him, who'd trusted him when it mattered. "Freedom's nice," he said slowly. "But I think I'll stick around. Someone's gotta keep you two out of trouble." Myra's lips twitched, almost a smile. Bold words, human. Cale's gaze warmed. Wise ones, too. Days later, the hold buzzed with rebuilding. Jack walked the glowing forest with Mira and Cale, the twin suns rising over a scarred but living world. They'd started as captors and captive, but the war had forged something stronger, a bond not of law, but choice. Mira taught him Clitheran combat forms, her strikes gentler now, while Cale dragged him into endless debates about tech and stars, his curiosity matching Jack's own. One evening, as they sat by a cliff overlooking the moons, Mira broke the silence. You could have left. Why stay? Jack leaned back, the moss cool beneath him. Ran from a lot in my life, jobs, fights, people. Never stuck around to see what came next. This time, I wanted to. Cale tilted his head, thoughtful. And what comes next? Jack grinned, the old spark flaring. Who knows? More chaos, probably. You two up for it? Myra's hand brushed his, firm and warm. Always. Cale's laugh was soft, rare. With you? Inevitable. The stars stretched endless above them, a canvas of possibilities. Jack didn't know what lay ahead, more wars, new worlds, or just quiet days with these two. But for the first time, he didn't need to run. He'd found something worth staying for, something humanity had given Clithra, not just survival, but grit, heart, and a fire no one could extinguish.